Good, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see everyone, and thanks so very much for joining NASA for today's session. As we settle into our shared virtual space, please join me in a moment of reflection to honor the lands we occupy and the histories of their indigenous peoples. As we acknowledge the taking of their lands and their lives, let us commit to responsible stewardship of the land and respect for the First Nations who remain part of the past, present, and future of the places we call home. Let us also commit to developing the relationships with Native communities that will help inform our meaningful actions moving forward as we advance equitable outcomes for them within our work. Let's also pause to remember lives lost from the COVID pandemic. It has affected American Indians disproportionately, especially in the ranks of elders who pass on language and tradition across generations. It has also disproportionately affected our Black and Latinx communities. As we come together and center ourselves in the conversations ahead, let us remember them and all those for whom equity has not been an option. Today's session will apply an equity lens to an important topic, the distribution of operating support dollars to the field. During my tenure as a state arts agency director, every time we did a field survey or a town hall meeting and asked the arts community what it needed, the number one request was always for flexible funding, money to pay staff, to pay artists, pay rent, keep the lights on. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that as an evergreen constituent need. And the pandemic closures and budget disruptions of the last 18 months have only intensified that need, especially for organizations that operate in lower income communities. So it's no accident that a large portion of state arts agency funding takes the form of general operating support grants. This kind of flexible, mostly unrestricted money is a lifeline for the arts. It boosts the capacity of arts organizations to serve their communities. It puts grantees in charge of determining the most impactful uses of the funds. And it's the kind of money that is less often available from other funders, making it an important grants niche for state arts agencies. So given the importance of general operating support funds, it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that these critical dollars get distributed equitably. How can state arts agencies reduce structural barriers to ensure that operating support grants reach all communities? That's the question today's session will tackle. We'll hear how 3 different states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, are approaching this challenge from their own unique vantage points. This session is one of many that NASA has been offering on the overall theme of equity in grant making. Some of you were in last month's session on new structures for artist support. I also recognize some faces from our programs on equity and funding for arts education, creative placemaking, panel practices, and when we explored NASA's Equity Choice Points tool. There's no one-size-fits-all equity solution that will work for every state. And I really want to reflect on that. I'll repeat it. There's no one-size-fits-all equity solution that will work for every state. So over time, NASA is sharing a variety of models, a productive and a provocative menu of possibilities, allowing you to choose which strategies can work best for you and for your state. The road to equity is best traveled in company. In fact, it's best traveled in good company, and y'all are the very best companions for this journey. So thanks so very much for being a part of the NASA learning community. I hope you'll be able to borrow some interesting ideas today and find mutual support during our time together. With that, I'll turn things over to NASA's very own Kelly Barstate to moderate our session.
Thanks, Pam, and hello, everyone. I'm glad we can come together today to talk about strategies for attaining equity in operating support grants. State arts agency grants go out in all shapes and sizes, and awards for specific projects are, of course, the most numerous, right? So state arts agencies make roughly 17,000 of those awards each year. They're tied to particular activities or policy goals, and they generate all kinds of goodness, but they come with restrictions on allowable expenditures. Project grants typically have a narrow purpose and can't be used for things like rent or admin or payroll. And those restrictions can make it hard for recipients to patch together the overhead they need to operate. Boulay once wrote a blog post about what it would be like to run a bakery with that kind of money. And I can't remember the details, but the story went something like this, right? So somebody really likes the nourishing, wholesome bread that you bake and wants to buy some, but they'll only pay for 50% of the bread. And you need to come up with the rest of the money to make it from someplace else. And that's what we cheerfully call matching. You can spend money on eggs, but not on yeast, and certainly not on the electricity needed to run the oven. The flour has to be certified as gluten-free, and afterwards you're supposed to measure the collective impact of each loaf. So you get the picture, right? The paradigm of chasing down and subsisting on fragmentary project grants is exhausting for anyone, but it's particularly problematic for smaller organizations, those that don't have access to wealth, those rooted in communities that are historically excluded or underserved. It can create a capacity trap that limits their ability to grow. And that's why operating funds are so important and why state arts agencies are so brilliant for operating them. Many foundations don't offer operating support grants, and except for COVID funds, the Arts Endowment is not allowed to either per statute. So this is a distinctive function that state arts agencies play. In typical years, states make operating support grants to the tune of $123 million a year. That's 40% of all funds awarded by state arts agencies, roughly 5,800 grants. So that's a lot of resources, and it makes sense for us to do all we can to make that funding accessible and equitable. Now, those of you who know me know that I am a big data nerd, right? And I'm proud of it. So I'll use some national numbers to call our attention to a few different dimensions of equity and to model some things that you might want to examine in your own state information. So the first thing that we're showing you here is a breakout of operating support awards by grantee budget size. Budget categories may be different for your state, but the gist of this is to gauge how state arts agencies are supporting small organizations, the rows at the top, versus the larger organizations, the rows toward the bottom. A few years ago, Helicon Collaborative put out a study finding that just 2% of cultural institutions in our country captured 60% of all philanthropic funds. You'll immediately notice on this slide that that's not the case with state arts agency grants. The largest two budget categories here are getting less than a third of operating support dollars. So our funding is more democratized. Look at the data for some of the smallest awards. Is this equitable given that 90% of cultural institutions in the United States have budgets under $1 million? And notice the high number of awards relative to those dollar amounts. How small does a grant have to get before it doesn't have an impact? Or is it worth the application burden? Those are tough questions that every state needs to weigh. Overall, the spatial spread of operating support grants is impressive, but it's important to look more closely at this too. My colleague, Kelly Liu, made some spiffy maps to help us take a geographic look at some other equity factors. For instance, 18% of the US population lives in rural areas, and 18% of operating support grants go to rural areas, so that seems proportional. But the grants shown here only represent 10% of all operating support dollars. So 10% of the money versus 18% of the population, we may have some equity headway to make there. Now, states are awarding a ton of other grants in rural areas, so we know that we're reaching those counties with project funds, but our operating support coverage is thinner in rural regions. So some of those groups are being asked to bake bread without being able to spend money on yeast. Ditto for economically distressed counties. We're using a pretty narrow definition of economic distress for this, based on unemployment rates a full point higher over average and per capita income of 80% or less of the national norm. Within those regions, more than 8% of the population lives in these counties, but that's close to 27 million people, right? Only 3% of our operating support dollars are awarded here, though. We don't have national data on race, ethnicity, or LGBTQ characteristics or other demographics of SAA grantees, but I know that a lot of you are finding ways to collect that kind of information at the state level. And that can be a central part of your equity analysis too, to see what groups have higher or lower participation rates, higher or lower funding success. So operating support programs from state arts agencies have been around for a long time, and they may have some legacy characteristics that lead to funding disparities. So you'll recognize many of the factors on these lists, so I'm not going to review all of them, but I will observe that most of them are double-edged swords. They may have valid underlying rationale, but on another level, they pose a lot of equity barriers. Take matching requirements, for instance. A lot of these are one-to-one match requirements, but I've also seen them as high as 3-to-1 for operating support in some states. And on one hand, this is what legislatures like to see: cost sharing and private funds and public investments leveraging each other. On the other hand, these matches can discourage applications, and they need to be cobbled together from fragments of other funding, which could be a net capacity drain rather than a capacity gain for some groups. Or take the point about using past award amounts to calculate new grants. No state arts agency wants to destabilize a grantee organization with wild fluctuations in funding if you can help it, right? So continuity is good, but the equity consequences are that a smaller organization can get pigeonholed into smaller grants, while larger organizations may maintain a lock on bigger awards, and that can perpetuate structural inequities. So you want to take a look at factors like this, weigh them for yourself to decide whether policies like this are advantages or impediments in your own state. So a lot of state arts agencies are taking stock of their grant making to put fresh eyes on longstanding practices and see what they're learning to adjust how dollars go out. I see a lot of different strategies at play, reworking formulas and experimenting with flat dollar amounts, instituting lower award caps for larger organizations, easing up on entrance criteria, even blurring the lines between project support and administrative support and general operating support. And some of those experiments are incremental and some are big leaps. What works for one state won't automatically work for another, depending upon each unique situation and a state's distinctive cultural ecosystem. But the common denominator is a drive toward greater equity and the goal of making sure no communities get left behind. So what does this look like in action? We're in luck because we have 3 of our colleagues who are here today to share with us what their strategies look like. I'm grateful to be alongside Carl Blischke from the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, Tamara Holmes Brothers from the North Carolina Arts Council, and Todd Trebor from the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. They're sharing the virtual stage with us today. Each of you has taken different approaches. You're all dealing with different politics, different geographies, and different arts dynamics. So it'll be really illuminating to listen for those contrasts. Tamara, Carl, and Todd will each give us an overview of their strategies, then we'll delve deeper through some conversation and Q&A. So as questions arise, keep putting them into the chat and we will address them when we reach the forum and the Q&A segment of today's program. So Tamara, you are first on our docket. Welcome, and please tell us a little bit about North Carolina's approach.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're looking forward to connecting with you and speaking with you about specifically what takes place in North Carolina with the North Carolina Arts Council. And Eric, I'm not seeing the slides, just okay, you're coming up with them. So as Eric is bringing up the slides, as we think about equitable operating support, accountability demands transparency, and transparency demands accountability. This belief is central to our work now more than ever. In today's presentation, I'll briefly discuss the North Carolina Arts Council's self-reflected journey towards equity in the arts. I hope that today's conversation encourages you to be intentional in creating arts for all people. I think you'll need to go back a couple of slides. Okay, you can go forward one more. Okay, here we go. The North Carolina Arts Council was created in 1967 with a mission of arts for all people. In the 1970s and 80s, many new arts nonprofits were created in the state, but relatively few were organizations of color led by leaders of color. In 1989 and 90, discussions with African American and Native American arts leaders revealed funding inequities regarding grant allocations. The North Carolina Arts Council responded by creating a multicultural requirement for a grassroots arts program, which asked our grassroots partners to spend a percentage of their allotment on programming reflecting diverse cultures. This requirement was enacted in 1990 and is still a requirement today. Organizations of Color Development Program, which was active from 1990 to 2010, the goal of the program was to help stabilize and grow a cohort of diverse organizations to grow equity in North Carolina's arts network. Most organizations funded steadily declined. This could be due to a number of things, one of which is the nonprofit model is less sustainable in communities with less resources. Next slide. In equity work, we can't afford to be neutral. We can't even afford to simply be good people. We have to be intentional people. Listening at a scale to be a better leader in the field of acknowledging that we have to lead with empathy, patience, and impact, while utilizing curiosity to learn what our constituents want. The North Carolina Arts Council is learning as we go and still learning as we grow. We are encouraging the work of inclusivity within the workplace and within our arts communities across the state. We are committed to providing programming and funding support that is fair, transparent, and just through this time of what we like to call a dual pandemic and beyond. Next slide. So looking at this dual pandemic with a lens of systemic racism in the arts, the North Carolina Arts Council notes that this is more than just why does diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, our DEAI, why does that matter? But why does it matter to the North Carolina Arts Council? Staff reaction to George Floyd's blatant visible racism and injustice led us to conversations of frustration, isolation, fear, discomfort, but still yet hopeful. Talking about how we feel being vulnerable without fear of judgment, listening, and I say listening with the intent of active listening, acknowledging those feelings, and discussing outcomes of change in response to lived experiences. Those discussions came in the form of supporting our values of arts for all people, funding priorities, and addressing structural inequalities within the organization by providing access to programs, services, and resources. Next slide. So during the period of sheltering at home in the arts sector, our North Carolina Arts Council established initiatives to aid the field. Under one roof, a virtual music festival produced in April of 2020 by some of our staff members in collaboration with the Charlotte-based entertainment publication Culture was promoted as a fundraiser for artists. The event received over 120,000 views and inspired donations of almost $50,000 to the North Carolina Arts Council Foundation to support artists across North Carolina whose work had been disrupted by COVID-19. In this support shift, the North Carolina Arts Council shifted our grant-making strategies for the fiscal year of 20 through 21, as well as in our current fiscal year of 21-22, to respond again to COVID-19. We redirected our funding from project grants to that we could put additional resources into stabilizing the operations of the state's arts infrastructure. The value of the creative economy in keeping our communities as vibrant places to live and work will continue to be even more important as we create a new normal in the future. This new normal has expressed a need for change through social justice. Next slide. To intentionally make space for positive change, initial conversations were conducted as a collective group, and then the call to act followed. The call to act was displayed in the form of our DEAI plan, addressing themes of agency transparency, enhanced organizational behavior and values, accountability, ongoing agency DEAI implementation, and truth-telling, addressing the historic and contemporary efforts of racism. The truth-telling was presented through our Arts Equity BIPOC forums to address community constituent concerns, frustrations, and hopes within the North Carolina Arts Council. This continued hope ignited a spark. Next slide. The North Carolina Arts Council has developed a marketing campaign to reinforce the arts sector as it rebounds during and from the pandemic. Sparking the arts will be crucial to the economic and social recovery of our communities across the state emerging from the pandemic. We initially started this fall of 2021 and will continue throughout 2022 to help raise public awareness and interest in engaging with and participating in North Carolina arts experiences, emphasizing vitality, fellowship, and most importantly, healing. These are the qualities that arts spark, and they are what North Carolina needs to rebuild its economy and emerge resiliency from the pandemic. We also will continue some of our programs and have enhanced our grants priorities. Again, with this fiscal year 21-22, continuing to sustainability to support organizations as much as possible. Artist support grants, 87% increase we saw in our grantees, expanding the administrative fee to include additional funding for marketing. Our Arts Equity Project grants, expanding our fiscal agency policy for project grants, allowing for more diverse cohort of grantees. As an inclusion strategy, the Arts Equity Project grant category, we changed our fiscal agency policy to accommodate applications from groups, arts groups, and individuals who were not in the process of becoming a 501c3. This was something that we specifically heard in some of those BIPOC conversations. Next slide. And in conclusion, the North Carolina Arts Council recognizes that we have to go beyond allyship. This is a time of action in becoming accomplices. What you've seen are some of the actions that we must do to empower our communities. By using our passion and purpose in the arts, we encourage you to revitalize, fellowship, and heal internally within your organizations and externally with your constituents to rebuild better communities together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamra. You shared so many interesting things, but a few that really stuck out for me were that reminder that if we're gonna know where we're going. We also have to recognize and reckon with where we've been. You know, I really
Yes.
love that. And you named some really important things about strategy shifts too, right? About allocating more agency resources into operating support and sustainability, not just as a reaction to pandemic, but also as kind of a forward field building strategy as well. And some interesting ideas about fiscal agents also that we might want to talk about later. So anyway, thank you so much. Really appreciate the overview of North Carolina. And now moving a little further north, Carl Blischke from Pennsylvania. Carl, go ahead and give us the scoop on your strategy up in the Keystone State.
Hi, everybody. Okay, Eric, you're pulling up the slides. Okay, I'm going to go over kind of our journey. I'm going to tell the story of how we started and what we did about it. Related to our general operating support category. So that's our story for today. So next slide, Eric. So our journey really started as part of our strategic planning process and the focus of that process. Not only did we interact with our grantees and survey our grantees about their aspirations and needs, but we also very specifically looked at what are the needs of Pennsylvania's communities. And many of Pennsylvania communities are struggling in terms of population and the impacts of deindustrialization. So our process was to meet in communities, and we had kind of small group meetings across the state in which we invited non-arts community members to tell us what's important for their communities. So that included local governments and social service agencies and housing and education and community and economic development. And I'll give you the headlines of what they told us when asked about what's important to their communities, what can make their communities great places to be. Number one, the communities that we talked to realized how important it was for them to be vibrant, attractive places. Number two, and this was across the board, whether we were in a more urban area or a more rural area, every one of them talked about DEI. And they were talking about changing demographics. And they were talking about the importance of DEI to their future strategies to be competitive for residents and workforce. And number three, they told us that the arts help their communities be vibrant places. However, access to and resources for the arts are not equitably distributed across the state. So as we came forward with our strategic plan and looked at all that data, we had a community focus, and that led us to a new mission. And our mission is to serve communities through the arts. In addition to creating a new mission statement for the first time ever in our existence, the council identified DEI as our overarching value in our cross-cutting strategy. So this is to say the importance of looking at DEI and looking at how resources are distributed across the state was baked in from the beginning. And we determined, and the council determined, we were going to do something about it. We were going to actually act on our plan. So next slide. So right after the council adopted this new strategic plan and new mission and new goals, the first thing the council said is, let's establish a committee to look at our general operating support and look at the funding formula for that. In our case, our general operating support, like many other agencies, that's our largest line item by far. It's the place we wanted to start. So we put together a committee of our council members, And we wanted to do that because we wanted this to be a whole agency approach. We really wanted to get the input and buy-in from our council. And it wasn't just our council that actually was participating. Every single staff member of the PCA was very much a part of that committee in pulling work together for it. So the committee looked at our data. We had to start there. What is actually happening? We actually, and this is a shout out to NASA, we wanted to look at what other states were doing, and NASA provided an overview of that and actually did case studies on several other state arts agencies, general operating support. So we looked at that. We heard from representatives from rural Pennsylvania, from urban Pennsylvania, from grantees representing rural communities, and grantees representing BIPOC communities. We talked to people from within the state, and we also talked to people from outside the state, trying to get kind of a 360 view for our council to look at. So as the committee went through this, I'll give you some of the key headlines. When we looked at our data and what had been happening historically, we realized that our grant amounts were very much tied to grantees' fiscal size. Some other kind of facts and circumstances there, like many other states, here's the shape of our curve for our grantees. The vast majority of them are under $1 million of fiscal size. Very few of them are above 50 million. That's kind of the curve. But grants have been tied to fiscal size. In addition, and thank you, Kelly, for bringing this up, some other things were in there too, like past grant amounts. Another really big finding for us, and this was very clear, was that our funding for BIPOC and rural grantees did not reflect the demographics or geography of Pennsylvania. So our committee worked together. We actually wrote a report from the committee with findings and recommendations for action. Next slide. So before I start on some of the things we did to develop a new funding strategy, since we had the data and since we heard from experts within the state and from outside of the state, we thought we had a really good business case going forward around increasing the equity of our funding. So as we were rolling through this, go back to that last one, we actually took this business case to our governor's office. And we said, we think that this is really important, and we would like to increase the equity of our grants distribution. And they said, okay. And they wrote it into the governor's budget. And I think this was the first time the arts actually was a theme in the governor's budget. And they used our words. They used our business case. And we were super excited about that. But then the pandemic happened before the budget process concluded, and that threw a lot of changes our way. So the idea was, even though we did not end up with the budget that the governor proposed, we had committed, and we told the governor's office, we're going to act regardless. This is how important it is. And so we did act. And this is what our funding strategy looked like. One is, based on the data, we were going to have to address the funding history and the inequity, specifically with respect to BIPOC and rural organizations. And to do that, we wanted to come up with how we were going to look at that. What are the definitions for that? So for BIPOC, we have a staff member who actually worked on this for a number of years, even leading up to this, Dana Payne. And we have six kind of criteria that we're looking at when we're talking about BIPOC for the purpose of this funding strategy. One, we're looking at the community that is served, the specific community that's served. We're looking at the mission and the vision and founder of the organization. We're looking, are the majority of artists and arts presented, produced, or exhibited reflective of the BIPOC experience? We're also looking at, where is this located? And is that serving a BIPOC community? We're looking at staff composition, and we're looking at board composition. So you can see it's kind of a holistic view. And of course, as we're looking at these organizations, these are the organizations that they're identifying as BIPOC also, of course. So our definition for rural, we went to the legislative office for all things rural, called the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, and talked to them about this. So we looked at their definition. It's a county definition that's based on population density. It is a definition that is used across many state agencies. And so that's what we went with. The next thing we wanted to do is look at what would it look like to really make a difference. And we wanted to provide the most meaningful response that we could, given our goal and our resources. So we came up with 2 funding tiers. And the goal here was to completely separate grant amounts from fiscal size. We completely broke that. It's not based on their assessment score. It's not based on their past award amount. It is based on 2 things. One, are you a BIPOC or rural organization, or are you not? And the way we started this was that our tier for BIPOC and rural, everybody in that category received $26,000. If you are not BIPOC or rural, that second tier is $13,000. And that's kind of where we are. It's also a function of how many grantees are in this pool and in our budget. We did this, we did not bring in any additional resources to do this. We did this with the resources that we had. So that is kind of how we went forward with it. You should know that this affects about 300 grantees each year. So the other thing that we determined was that this was not going to be a one-time thing. We thought that additional resources to a lot of organizations was relevant to the pandemic. But for us, this is really a long-term strategy, and all of our funding going forward will be through this equity lens. All right, next slide. So here's some headlines about what happened when we employed this strategy. One of the facts and circumstances is generally our grants are not large. So the average grant to a BIPOC organization increased from $10,000 to $26,000. The average grant to a rural organization increased from about $7,700 to $2,600. And for everyone else, it decreased from $16,000 to $13,000. So you should know that across this population, again, I said our grants were not very large. Our average grant for everybody was $14,000. However, you know how things work on a curve. So we did have grants to a few organizations that were much larger than the average. Our largest grant prior to this strategy was $160,000. So that grant changed from $160,000 to $13,000. Okay, next. Here's headlines. Basically, all of our BIPOC and rural grantees received increases. I thought that was really good news. On the flip side, I think that tells you what our average grants were to BIPOC and rural grantees. Here's the other thing that we think is really important. Regardless of what tier they were in, 73% of our grantees received increases. Okay, next slide. I kind of want to do a summary of the things that we did and some of the steps that we took. We talked about the strategic planning process. That was really a way for us to hear from communities. And what we heard from communities is that the distribution and availability and access to arts assets and resources is important for their communities. That council committee and getting the buy-in from not only our council, but I think all of our staff was really big. It was an all hands on deck experience. And I wish I could have videotaped, I guess, the all hands on staff meetings as they tried to untangle our funding formula. That would have been magic. I'm sure it could have been a documentary on Netflix. Unfortunately, we did not capture that nor monetize it, but that's what happened. And they can tell you interesting stories about that. Other key points here, because we were making a big change. Here's how we rolled this out. We went to the governor's office and our liaisons there, and we laid out what we were going to do. And we had a very frank conversation with them about what it meant, why it was important, and who would be impacted. And I'm really pleased to say that at the end of that briefing, our liaison said, pretty close to a quote, "Well, I can't argue with that." That was really good news for us. We also had briefing with legislative members. We have an arts and culture legislative caucus in state, bipartisan, bicameral. So we went to the chairs of that caucus, some of whom are in leadership, and we laid this out. And they said, okay, we understand what you're doing. Here's another thing that we did, and I'm really thankful to Nora Johnson on our staff, because she took every one of these calls with me. But we called every grantee that was really going to receive a material decrease. So that was weeks of one-on-one conversations with all of our grantees that were impacted with a decrease. And that was very enlightening. And I think extremely important to have that one-on-one space with them. And finally, this was really important to us. And so we wanted to tell the story from the governor's office. So we put out a press release from the governor's office, which gets more attention than me saying something, because it represented a shift for us. We wanted to signal to everybody what was happening in a transparent way and lay forward a strategy that would be shaping the way that we go forward with funding for the years to come. So that's kind of our story, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Carl. Really, really powerful and provocative stuff there. I appreciate so much how you laid the groundwork for your changes in community needs, and not just in the needs of the arts organizations, but in the needs of Pennsylvania communities, how that was kind of a foundational rationale for all of the changes, how it was really data-driven and so intentional in seeking support from your authorizers and from other places in state government. So lots of good stuff there to inform and to inspire. Thank you. And now to round out our trio of state arts agency panelists, we will hear from our small but mighty New England neighbor, Todd in Rhode Island will walk us through RISCA's approach. So take it away, Todd.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, NASA, and thank you all for being here today. While Eric pulls up the slides, let me just say that what I'm going to share with you is a preview, and I'm happy to have more fulsome conversations with anyone who is interested, excuse me. I'm an extrovert in a pandemic and would love to talk with more people, so I'm happy to talk more about this as well. And I'll keep on riffing while Eric's pulling things up. So I'm going to talk to you all today or tell you all about how RISCA engaged our community in making our operating support program more equitable in its restructure. And I am the organizations program director at RISCA. I'm in charge of our project grants to organizations, our general operating support grants, as well as just whatever additional duties as needed, as I'm sure you all have as part of your job descriptions as well. And okay, great. Now I can see it. All right, great. So that's what I'm talking with you all about today. Next slide, please, Eric. That's who I am. That's me and my street in Providence. Next slide, please, Eric. All right. So getting to us and our restructure of the general operating support program. So let's all get back in the time machine and go back to fall of 2019. At that point in time, RISCA had just completed and approved a value statement that was developed in conversation with communities throughout Rhode Island. We had also just developed a final draft of our strategic plan. Both of those documents had a lot in them, but I'll just highlight some values that are relevant to this conversation. Top of mind, of course, was equity and access. And also, as Tamara pointed out, we also had as a value that was of interest to us as an agency, prominently, transparency and consistency. The governor-appointed council that governs our agency requested that the program directors at RISCA reevaluate and in some instances restructure their programs through the lens of our general operating, the lens of our strategic plan and our value statement. So first up was our general operating support program, which had a lot of problems. There was a lot of inequity inherent in the program. As you can see, 50% of the general operating support budget went to just 5 organizations out of 52 in the program. The program was non-competitive, so once you were in, yet it had a stable budget. So I can't get into the details of this in 10 minutes, but in the past 12 years, we've actually done a lot of work to get more programs, more organizations into the program. However, all those organizations' grant award sizes were $5,000 a year or less. The median grant award size in the program as it existed before this restructure was $5,000. There was no funding formula. Hooray! It was historic. There was not a lot of rhyme or reason as to who was receiving the grant awards that they were receiving, although you can imagine that the larger and wider your organization was, the larger the grant award tended to be. There were a dearth of BIPOC-centered organizations in the program. We use that term meaning BIPOC-led and deeply engaging organizations, about 6 out of the 52. And lastly, there was just an inconsistency and opacity to this program that was damaging to the arts and culture community. In my first year at RISCA, I met with every organization in this program at least once, some of them several times, and this was a consistent topic of conversation about how they were angry about their grant award, about how they resented an organization over there for getting more than them, about how they just didn't understand the program. So clearly there was some issues out there with the program, and we needed to address those in the process we used to restructure the program as well. Next slide, please, Eric. So in thinking about how to go about doing this, we had in our rearview mirror a prior experience we had with restructuring the general operating support program. About 10 or 12 years ago, there was some work done, as I mentioned earlier, to really open the general operating support program up, and it allowed for an influx of a lot of new organizations. When that was done as well, there was a funding formula developed to address the issues I just identified. However, there was no community process leading into the development of the formula. The formula was presented at a public meeting with arts and culture community members, and the meeting was very acrimonious, very traumatic, I believe, for RISCA staff. And what ultimately happened was the funding formula was not implemented, but there were still a lot of spiky feelings in the community around this experience. So when thinking about the process we wanted to use for the restructuring of our general operating support program this time, we wanted first and foremost a process that was consistent with our strategic plan. So our values, particularly around equity and access and transparency and consistency. We wanted a process that involved the arts and culture community from the very beginning. We wanted them to be involved in co-creating the architecture for this program and the big picture thinking about it, not so much the smaller details of it. And lastly, we wanted a process and a program that the arts and culture community could respect. We knew that what we were going to develop was not going to be universally loved by everyone. We wanted something that was, in as much as possible, universally respected. Next slide, please, Eric. So what we proposed in February of 2020 to the council that governs RISCA was creating a working group of 36 members representing organizations from around the state, various sizes, various organizational disciplines. It would be comprised of both current grantees in the program that would be recruited through a very, very simple application process. And then myself, in partnership with my amazing colleague, Elena Calderon-Patino, who manages the community arts program at RISCA, we would reach out to members of the Rhode Island Expansion Arts Program and stipend them for participating in the working group. The Rhode Island Expansion Arts Program is a partnership between RISCA, the Humanities Council in Rhode Island, and the Rhode Island Foundation. It's a capacity building program for culturally specific organizations, AKA BIPOC-led and deeply engaging organizations that are arts and culture in the state of Rhode Island. The charge of this working group, as I mentioned before, a little bit would be to co-create program goals, evaluation criteria and program features, and then funding formula. So we wanted to address the bigger picture elements first. Obviously, we wanted to address the cake before we got to the icing. The granular details of the new program, meaning the application, its questions, other nuances, would be determined by a future working group, which I'll just make small mention of later because that work has happened. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk, because I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, just in big picture about how the working group worked. The 36 members came together in May of 2020 for a virtual meeting where they learned about the history of inequity in arts funding and then the way in which arts funding could be made more equitable. So we set the table for them and gave everyone the same starting tools and ideas at the very least. Obviously, they had other ones that occurred to them as well. Then the process after that was essentially, I would give them content to react to, and they would react to it. And I would draft things, show them those drafts, they would react to those drafts. And whenever I showed them a draft, I also would have notes under there that was summarized versions of information they had given me, being like, hey, this is where I'm getting this idea from. It comes actually directly from you all. So in that process, that's the process we use to develop the draft program goals, to develop the draft program features, to develop the draft evaluation criteria. They did that work after their first full group meeting in 4 different breakout groups of 9 individuals each that were obviously carefully curated. When we got those 3 units done, I synthesized them into draft guidelines, and I also developed a draft funding formula based on the guidelines that they had developed. In October, the BIPOC members of the working group, there were 12 out of 36, had their own breakout group where they took an initial pass at these draft guidelines and at the draft funding scheme and provided me with feedback. I then took that, redrafted those things, shared it with the full group at the end of October of 2020, got their reactions and input. There was no approval process here. It was about them investing their energy and ideas. Shared that with the council at RISCA. It was approved for a public process after that. And then after a month-long public review process in March of 2020, the new program was approved. Next slide, please. So what are the new notable program features? First and foremost, we now have explicit goals around recruitment of BIPOC-centered organizations and organizations from unrepresented geographies in the program. We are keeping a 3-year grant cycle that we had, as well as a budget cohort model for evaluation. Organizations of a like budget size were evaluated together. But we're going to have tiered applications that are different depending on the budget size of the organization. Final reports have also been simplified. The final reports primarily consist of a meeting with the organization's program director and then some other data elements to fill out. Fiscal sponsorship is now possible for organizations in this program with budgets under $50,000 a year, and there is no minimum budget requirement. Next slide, please. Panel process representation requirements. There are 5 panelists per group of applications of a certain budget size. At least 2 of those now have to be BIPOC individuals, and at least 1 has to be a practicing artist. Part of our panel trainings we're evolving now, but we were including an implicit bias component. Shout out to Maryland State Council on the Arts for sharing their implicit bias training. We have also baked into these guidelines, and this is the most exciting piece for me as some kind of policy wonky nerdy person, evaluation at the 5-year and 10-year marks of this program. Both of those evaluation periods will be co-led or stewarded by a BIPOC majority working group. At the 5-year point, they will make suggestions based on the data of who the program is hitting, how it might be adjusted within its current structure. And at the 10-year mark, a full restructure will be done. So you won't have this avoidance of it. It'll just be something that we will have to do. Evaluation criteria, possible circular grant for BIPOC-centered organizations. I'm going to leave that to question and answer for someone to ask me about that. But there's a way in which we're thinking about getting more money to BIPOC-centered and organizations that are led by and deeply engaged people with disabilities. Evaluation criteria are artistic vibrancy and relevancy, organizational capacity and ingenuity, and commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. I forgot the A there. Next slide, please. New funding scheme. There's a formula, hurrah. So that now exists, which is deeply exciting. On top of, embedded in the formula and on top of it is also additional funding consideration for BIPOC-centered organizations and organizations that are led by and engaged the disabled community. Their grant awards are 1.5 times larger than other organizations of a similar budget size. Basing a grant award on budget size is obviously an equity issue and is a lingering one, which is one of the reasons why we chose to embed those working groups at the 5- and 10-year mark in our political landscape. It was just not something that we could push. It was pushing too far in the conversation for where we were at collectively. The award ranges have contracted enormously. 95% of grant awards now will be between $4,000 and $27,000 a year. There will be 1 or 2 organizations that get awards that are $3,000 a year and 1 or 2 that get awards that are $40,000 a year, depending on panel review, because the program is now competitive. And panel scores will determine whether or not an organization gets the standard award for their budget category, also given their identifiers, or whether or not they get, a high award or a low award, depending on panel score. Next slide, please. What did everyone think? So the group actually had a really great time. It definitely there were moments of tension. There was some yelling, all of the things that you would expect to happen in these kind of conversations. But overall, 95% of respondents to a survey about what they thought about the process said that they really enjoyed it and that they developed relationships. They had a chance to develop their own leadership skills and that they respected the guidelines that were developed. So when we went into the whole conversation with humility and transparency and robust communication. And we shifted the process multiple times, depending on what the working group thought as they gave us feedback. And as they gave us feedback and we shifted, that made an environment of trust where they felt more comfortable to ask for more things. And lastly, and I can talk about this in Q&A, what was interesting for me to see was the setup and structure empowered white allies in breakout groups in equity conversations when they arose. Next slide, please. Okay, really quick shout out because so many of you, my colleagues at state arts agencies, were incredibly helpful in this conversation as thought partners and in being generous and sharing your brilliance and expertise, as well as colleagues at local agencies and as well as just colleagues in the field of Rhode Island. So I just wanted to give a moment to awash you and praise here, even if you're not here. So next slide, please. Great, thank you everyone. Eric did share the draft guidelines. They have not been updated since the public process. So there's some things that are hairy in there. I'm happy to share the final version once we get those done.
Thank you so very much, Todd. I just took a whole raft of notes from the story that you told and a few things that I circled that I just think are so helpful. The goal is not to create a process or a product that everybody loves, but that everybody understands and everybody can respect. Love that, love that. Stipends for process advisors, really important equity issue, and that when we're asking and engaging communities, that we're not asking for uncompensated labor. So very helpful. Baking evaluation into the program design. And a process also that is designed to build allies. So I just feel like I went to school, right, with all three of you, Tamara, Carl, and Todd, so many different angles and ideas from all three of your states. I'm really eager to learn more. So I have a whole stack of questions that I'd like to ask, but I first want to give the floor to a few of the questions that have come in via chat. So we'll begin there, then I'll pop in with some of my questions and we'll just kind of go back and forth. One thing about for you, Carl, that Karen from DC asked, and that was for the organizations at the top of the budget scale that went from large awards to smaller awards. How did they react? And were you concerned about destabilizing them through the changes in your grant amounts? How would you respond to that, Carl?
Right. So I will say, looking at the big picture, the grantees that we called responded very well. And I was really heartened by that. So we heard things like, it's not great to hear that our grant is being cut, but we get what you're doing and we support it. That was on a whole. However, some organizations, had different takes on it. And I'll just give you a smattering here, but some organizations had difficulty framing this around historical inequities. And they wanted to know, well, what can I do to get a bigger grant? I mean, can I be better? So that's one thing that we dealt with, right? Others were like, I really like equity. That looks like me getting the exact same grant that I always got. And frankly, some people said some art is better than others. So I give that for context, but on a whole, I was really heartened, and those were not easy calls, but in some ways they were inspiring. In terms of destabilizing, obviously the arts organizations at this size, I will say our historic grant amounts, even our larger grant amounts, represented a fraction of 1% of their operating budget annually. Now, in the pandemic, particularly for organizations that relied very heavily on earned income, I mean, this was not a great year. This was a bad year for them, even though they are large. But I did not think that this change, frankly, was the destabilizing factor, as opposed to a global pandemic. But thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. I appreciate the deliberacy of the conversations that you had one-on-one with the organizations that were going to be most deeply affected, and creating as much understanding as possible. Back to Todd's point about, even if they don't love their new grant amount, they can understand it and they can respect it. So Todd, a number of people in the chat took your bait about wanting to talk more about your circular grants, which I have to say sounds very worrying. So say some more and set our minds at ease that circular grants are not a problem.
Yeah, I'll set your minds at ease. So that was interesting because it exemplified something about this process, about the degree to which the working group was negotiating amongst themselves. So one of the things when the BIPOC breakout group saw the draft funding scheme, they were disheartened to see that the grant award sizes were still tethered to budget size. And I acknowledge, and we acknowledge, that that is 100% an equity issue. But I want to just evoke Kathy Shea here from the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, who was an amazing mentor to me in this process. And one of the things that she said is, when you're pushing the boulder up the hill, you have to be aware of avalanches. And she's like, for you all, when I was developing this, she's like, for you all to go from historic funding to just flat grant amounts, she's like, you're going to skip a step there. Like, you need to ease a lot of these larger budget, politically connected organizations into this process. So I was really transparent with the breakout group about that. And so we came up with a solution where I adjusted, or RISCA adjusted, the grant award amounts for the largest organizations to be slightly less, and that we then would have a circular grant, meaning that it would be a $10,000 grant that would be given to two organizations that fit the definition. So BIPOC-centered, or organizations that are led by and deeply engaged communities with people with disabilities. It would live with two organizations, each getting a $10,000 grant for 2 or 3 years, and then move on to 2 other organizations that are within the program. That is still just an idea. That's why I say possible, because I'm going to drive the car around again to some of the breakout group members and be like, hey, that was something we talked about before. Is that something you still want, or would it be more of interest to just increase the grant awards to organizations? So that's why I put possible in there. It was cool that that idea kind of came out of it and we had that conversation about it. And the niceness of having that easy dialogue with community members when you're trying to develop the best kinds of things to support the work that they're doing.
Well, and it's also a testimony to the freedom with which your group felt like it could imagine possibilities, right? Which seems like just the ideal kind of mutual trust and experimental mindset that you want in a group that's trying to work on these kinds of equity issues. Tamara, I want to circle back to a point that you made about fiscal sponsors for organizations. We had an interesting chat thread going on a little earlier about, okay, federal funds, not federal funds restrictions, right? So we've dealt with that in the chat, but what I'd like to invite you to say a little bit more about is, what's the strategy underlying that, and what are you seeing about 501c3 status as an equity barrier in North Carolina?
From the conversations that we've had with our constituents in the field, some are in the process of completing their paperwork for the 501c3 status, and then there are some that just simply aren't interested in becoming a nonprofit organization. So if we are truly going to make an attempt to meet our mission of arts for all people, we do have to take some of this into consideration. So we're still experimenting with this overall concept, but allowing those organizations that are 501c3s to collaborate within their communities, which is in a sense forcing them and pushing them to go beyond their immediate networks and their Rolodexes. I'm dating myself, but but going to where the people are and meeting them where they are to meet the needs of so many across the state. So looking at whether we like it or not, those specific needs and interests and those frustrations that the communities have had with the historical guidelines and practices of the Arts Council, and looking at ways in which we can modify but still yet being compliant within state and federal mandates.
For sure. So one other question that's coming up for me, because one of the things that I find just so brilliant and clever about the North Carolina strategy is the equity project grants, right? That's a new category for you all. It's something that I think you conceived of and rolled out during the pandemic when you were busy with many, many other things, right? And what's interesting to me about that is that, unlike traditional project support grants that you see from a lot of other states, that grant category does allow some expenditures for certain types of administrative and operational functions, right? So can you speak a little bit more about the genesis of that grant program, how you have rolled it out to the field, what's the response like, and what's your early read on what that's accomplishing?
So how that came about, at the beginning of George Floyd's murder, we began having those internal conversations in what the staff wanted to see within the work that they wanted to really truly change in the communities. And then extending those conversations to BIPOC communities specifically, because we did notice, we did an internal DAI research data. So we looked at the lack of organizations of color that were receiving allocations from the North Carolina Arts Council. So with that data, of course, we have to have the documentation to back up anything that we do, especially during this time, in using those phrases of BIPOC and identifying specific target audiences. So in extending those conversations, we had to show some accountability, not necessarily in being reactive, but being responsive to what we were hearing and acknowledging from the field. So we generated some conversation internally with our program directors and conversations that they were having as well, bring all that to the table to develop this new category. We're still in an exploratory phase. This is we finished our first deadline. We're in our second phase of a deadline. So we've offered an opportunity for constituents to apply for this grant. If they were able to meet the first deadline, they met that, and then the panel reviewed those, and we're in the process of allocating and distributing that funding. But we're fast approaching on October 4th for the second deadline. So those that weren't particularly ready or prepared at that first deadline, they're able to connect with program directors during office hours, which is new with the North Carolina Arts Council as well, so that they can have those inquiries met with that one-on-one intimacy within those office hours, so that they can be better prepared for the application time for submission. So we're getting ready to go into our second phase of the Arts Equity Project grants with panels. And what we found was that our communities want the same thing. They want to have that diversity in the work that they do and they project to create that public value, if you will, as well as revitalizing communities, which is so needed because we've been physically isolated with being sheltered in place, and now starting to somewhat get back into what people think normalcy was. And then that social isolation of what we were forced to see within the communities, whether they were in the streets, protesting, advocating for social justice, or what we saw visibly on the screens of television. So with these project grants, seeing that the constituents are being responsive in what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and wanting to make those changes in their immediate communities, not just with the murals that we've been seeing across the country with Black Lives Matter and the collaboration of multiple artists coming together in consolidation to meet that visual need of community, but incorporating that with multi-generations, from youth to what I like to say are seasoned residents and citizens of the state as well. So really looking at how our communities are thinking broader and sincerely and intentionally about some of the things that they want to do within their communities, and submitting that in the application process. So we're looking forward to receiving and reviewing the upcoming applications. So, and then our panels are just as diverse as the communities that we serve. So they're excited about what they're reviewing as well within the panel process, and are even challenging us at the same time to kind of push that needle of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that point, because even if you change guidelines or establish a new program, but you panel applications in the same way, you may not attain the outcomes that you're looking for. So very, very, very important point. All right, so Carl, I've got a quick one for you from our chat stream, and then I have a couple of other questions for our panel group as a team. So Carl, this one comes from David. Just to reiterate, whether the award amounts for the larger organizations in your original funding stream was 160,000 or 16,000. Can you just confirm?
Yeah, so on average, our average grant amount across the population was $16,000. But within that average, we did have some grants that were much larger than that. Our top grant, not our average, previously was 160,000.
Right. So, and that $160,000 tier is now in the flat funding tier of 13,000. Is that correct?
Correct.
Got it. Okay. Here's a question from Rebecca. Did any of you have discussions about small organizations with low cash income or expenditures and high levels of in-kind or volunteer support? How do you get operating support to those groups? Todd or Carl or Tamara?
So for our program, we don't have a minimum budget requirement, and fiscal sponsorship as a possibility in the general operating support program. So sort of in the sideways ways that can address that. Also, when developing the evaluation criteria, something that was really important to many of the breakout group members was that if we're evaluating organizational capacity, we use the appropriate lens for the organization, given their size and the community that they're in. So we borrowed a lot around that from the Arizona Commission on the Arts with their general operating support program and how they view flexibly an organization's capacity based on the community that they're in. So we allow them to talk about, we will allow them the application, which is being developed now, to talk about resources beyond money that support their organization within their community.
Kelly, I'll just say quickly that separate from what we were talking about, we have a decentralized program of regranters across the state. And in that program, we serve about 350 organizations with general operating support. There are organizations or programs in that category that are as small as $6,000.
I'm glad you brought that up, Carl, because that's another, Tamara, it's another thing that's true for North Carolina is you've got that robust system of regional regranting and county regranting. I know that you have equity stipulations and demographic requirements for those regranters as well. So for those state arts agencies that do regranting, that's a whole other layer of equity to consider in as part of the mix. So I'd like to use you all as a sounding board for a difficult question. All right, brace yourself. Don't be alarmed, but brace yourself, right? So I want to play devil's advocate. This is a question that I hear all the time as a counterpoint to equity work. And I'd like to know how you would respond to this question based on your experience in retooling your grant making. And the question goes something like this. Larger organizations serve larger audiences. They serve more of the public. So isn't it appropriate that they get a lot more money to do that? What's your response to that rationale?
I think it's a double-edged sword, if you will. So if you have this large audience, what does that audience look like? And how do you go about reaching that audience? Are you going beyond that, again, that Rolodex that you already have to reach those communities that one may not have the financial resources, the transportation to get to your event, or the translation too, to understand the communication of the marketed event. So in thinking about that, not just the budget, and the size of the audience, what does that audience look like? Is it truly reflective of the communities that we serve? If we are truly to meet arts for all people, we have to do the work. And not necessarily being complacent, if you will, and simply sending out an email to our standard network.
Carl, Todd, what would you add?
I concur with what was just said. That was so great. The only thing I'll add is when you look at public dollars in serving community, one factor that is really important is where is that activity located? And there's really good research out of the social impact of the arts and culture blocks saying actually the actual block where activity is located is super important. If you go back and review the NGA report on rural prosperity, all kinds of correlation with the presence in a rural community of arts activities in healthy economic indicators. So it's not just about who, it's also about where.
Thank you for letting me go last, you two, and for your amazing responses. I think the things I would add is that, sure, but those organizations are not of and by all the communities throughout Rhode Island, right? They might be engaging a large number of people, but they're not of and by the diverse communities that we have in Rhode Island. And that a lot of the reason that they are large has to do with historic, essentially, subsidization and access to resources that many, many communities have been denied intentionally for decades, if not centuries. And I think the last thing that I think about a lot, which I don't think is something that was really helpful for certain decision makers, but our obligation as state agencies to foster and promulgate cultural democracy, that is what makes our communities and our country strong, is when we empower the diversity of cultures within them, because we need all of those perspectives for the problems that we're going to be facing, that we're facing now and that we'll be facing moving forward into the future.
Well said, all three of you. I want to take you with me wherever I go. Are you available to join? One thing I'd layer on to what all three of you said is that the public purpose does not necessarily equal butts and seats, right? That there are a lot of reasons, as you mentioned, Todd, to invest in the arts. There's a lot of community development work that happens through the arts, and it can actually only be accomplished at the hyper-local level, right? It's the same reason that government has a strong commitment to supporting small businesses and independent entrepreneurship, not just the mega corporations, because there's something very powerful about intersecting with communities at the granular local level. It's about how it happens, where it happens, and who's engaged, and not just about the numbers game, for sure. So we have so many other great questions in the chat. I wish I could make a unilateral decision to just extend this conversation for an hour, but I would have people yelling at me if I did that. So I will make a promise to get back to everybody who has a question in the chat that we didn't have a chance to answer. So stay tuned for that. And in the meanwhile, I think we should transition to a close here. I really appreciate all of your perspectives, Carl and Todd and Tamara. It's helpful to hear about the journeys you've been on and the different processes you've put in place to be successful and to work toward greater equity. And NASA offers a variety of resources that can help state arts agencies chart their own course here. In fact, just today, we've released a trio of new resources on equity. And Eric is going to put those up on the screen and also plop a link in the chat. These reports were crafted in cooperation with our good friends at ArtsWA, the Washington State Arts Commission, and they take a look at a variety of equity strategies being adopted by state arts agencies across the country. So the first one offers in-depth case studies of 4 state arts agencies: California, South Carolina, Maryland, and Massachusetts. And it looks at how those agencies are integrating equity work across all aspects of their agencies, their strategic planning, their programming design and development, their policies, and their partnerships. Second report is specific to equity strategies for state level public art programs. Now that's an area where there's not been as much research conducted. So NASA's pretty excited to be able to begin to take a look at that in conjunction with a roundtable of state arts agency public arts managers from across the country. And then to flesh out the trio, we have a third report on deepening community relationships. That's a broad spectrum report that has applicability to planning, to communications, to program design, to grantee recruitment, to field work, to capacity building. That report too was informed by a roundtable focus group of state arts agencies from across the nation, as well as information gathered from more than half of state and regional arts organizations. So I hope you have a chance to check those resources out. And of course, they're just the latest additions in a much larger suite of equity-related resources that you can find on NASA's website. We've got a database of program examples that you can access, professional development sessions. You can watch past professional development sessions online and also see what's coming around the bend. We've got a link to our inclusive language guide and the equity choice points toolkit that Pam mentioned earlier. We have a consultant directory of DEI facilitators, trainers, and consultants that we're going to be updating right now very soon. So stay on the lookout for that announcement and so much more. So we're always adding resources to this collection, and please visit it often. I want to also take a moment to reflect that there's something special about this time in our field. I've been at NASA for 30 years as of this summer. I hit my 30-year anniversary in July. And I have to say that the state arts agency field was talking about equity before I got here. So this is not a new conversation, but there is an energy behind it that I haven't seen before in the past 3 decades. I see a lot of experimentation and different ways that state arts agencies are creating not just safe spaces to explore these ideas, but brave spaces to do the work, to see the gaps and talk about the gaps explicitly and tackle the problems. And you're doing that in ways that really pave the way for enduring support so that stakeholders across the continuum can continue to see the value of state arts agencies. And that's part of what I found so inspiring about the stories that all 3 states shared with us today, interacting with communities, interacting with authorizers, interacting with and beyond the arts community to really work toward consensus values on how to serve our communities through the arts. So that's a needle that's worth threading. And I'm really proud of our field and the work that we're doing, because we all thrive when we all thrive, and we are living proof of that. Like Pam said, equity is a road best traveled in company. So do not hesitate to lean on each other and to lean on NASA as you are assessing what will work for your state and thinking about what you want to keep, what you want to change, and what you want to try. We are here to be your supportive learning community. And with that, I believe we will bring today's session to a close. And thank you again to Tamara and Todd and Carl for their inspiration. Thanks to Eric Giles for running our back end and being our Zoom sorcerer. And thanks to all of you also for participating. We will see you next at our final learning series session of the year, our virtual business meeting and celebration on October 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern. So please join us there. And everyone, be well till then.